So, the sonnet. As we already know, the sonnet is a 14 line single stanza poem. The 14 lines are composed of iambic pentameter lines, 10 syllables, 5 iambic feet, da da. The sonnet in English takes one of two forms generally. One form of the sonnet in English is known as the Italian or Petrarchan sonnet. This kind of sonnet had its origin in Italy with the poet Petrarch, who, in the sonnet form, wrote love poems to his beloved, a woman named Laura. And the poems were fiercely passionate laments of this speaker's inability to gain the affection of his beloved Laura. And often he described himself suffering mightily, as if he were a ship without rudder or sail on a tumultuous ocean. Such was his pain when Laura would not return his affection. Or most famously, he says, I'm in such pain with my desire that it's like I am burning and freezing at the same time. I burn with my desire for you, but yet I freeze because you will not reciprocate my desire. Some call this hyperbolic expression of passion in imaginative terms the Petrarchan conceit. It might recall to you the metaphysical conceit that we discussed in relation to John Donne. A little different. Well, Petrarch, writing in Italian, found it fairly easy to generate rhyme. A lot of Italian nouns end in vowels. So the Petrarchan or Italian sonnet, again, 14 lines, iambic pentameter in English, has this rhyme scheme: A, B, B, A, A, B, B, A. That's the first 8 lines, known as the octave. A, B, B, A, B, B, A. And then the next 6 lines, known as the sestet, usually go C, D, C, D, C, D. Or sometimes C, D, E, C, D, E. There's room for variation in the sestet. So you can see how the Italian sonnet might be a little challenging for a writer in English, because English words don't offer the same ease of rhyme as Italian words. Now, certainly there are some great sonnets in English written in this Petrarchan form. A second primary form of sonnet in English is known as the Elizabethan or Shakespearean sonnet. In the 16th century, an English poet named the Earl of Surrey tried to figure out ways to turn the Italian sonnet into a form more amenable to English. And he developed this English sonnet, again, eventually called the Shakespearean sonnet, because Shakespeare used this sonnet form in his great sonnet sequence. Some of the greatest sonnets in the English language appear in Shakespeare's sonnet sequence. And the English sonnet goes like this in terms of rhyme scheme. Again, 14 lines, iambic pentameter lines, A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. Now, as I hinted at a minute ago, the Italian sonnet usually falls into 2 distinct parts, the octave and the sestet. Generally speaking, the octave will propose a problem and the sestet will propose a solution to the problem. And the moment that marks the turn between the octave and the sestet is known as the volta, or the change or the turn. Now, Italian sonnets in English don't always play out that way in terms of structure, but they often do. It's sort of a call and response, if you will. Here's an issue, here's a problem, here's a theme, and what am I going to do about it? Well, first 8 lines lay out the problem, the theme, and the last 6 address the problem or the theme. Now, as you can see, the English sonnet doesn't fall rhyme-wise into an octave and a sestet. It proceeds more through quatrains. You can think of the English sonnet as having 3 distinct quatrains, followed by a concluding couplet. So in an English sonnet, often the problem, the question, the theme will be considered over the first 12 lines. Not the first 8 necessarily, but the first 12. And then the poet will come in with a hopefully epigrammatic couplet that concludes emphatically the particular issue that's being explored. So oftentimes, because of these repeated quatrains, the English sonnet will propose a theme in, say, the first quatrain, the first 4 lines, and then consider the theme from a slightly different angle in the next 4 lines, the second quatrain. And then maybe consider the theme from yet another point of view in the next 4 lines before finally concluding. Or you sometimes see an increased intensification over those 3 quatrains, followed by, again, that resounding conclusion. So the Shakespearean sonnet, English sonnet, Elizabethan sonnet invites repetition with a difference. Refrain. Here's the same issue seen from a different point of view. Here's the same issue seen in an intensified fashion as the poem unfolds over those 3 quatrains. And then, again, the couplet often provides a kind of emphatic conclusion. Now, sometimes you will see in a Shakespearean sonnet the octave sestet turn. It shows up quite frequently, in fact. Shakespeare often employs the Italian volta. So what I'm saying is that the sonnet in English is a very flexible form. You see poets using the Elizabethan form in terms of rhyme, but the Italian sonnet in terms of structure, the octave sestet, all the time. Now there's another kind of English sonnet, the Shakespearean sonnet, which is not as popular, so we're not going to talk about that right now. What is it about the sonnet? The sonnet started out, as I suggested, as a love poem form, the form of in which Petrarch laments his failed love for his beloved Laura. And certainly in the early modern period, the period of Shakespeare, the sonnet was primarily a form used for love lyrics, first-person utterances of romantic love. That is true in Shakespeare's sonnet sequence. It is true in Sir Philip Sidney's sonnet sequence, Astrophel and Stella. And it was true in the sonnets of, say, an Earl of Surrey as well. Of course, over time, poets started writing about other subjects in the sonnet. John Donne, for instance, in his so-called holy sonnets, writes about his love for God in sonnet form. By the time we get to the so-called Romantic age of Wordsworth and Keats and Shelley, we see these poets writing about most any subject in the sonnet form. Beauty, love, death, political issues, whatever. So the sonnet starts out as a form conducive to the love utterance, and over time it develops into an utterance really for most any sort of lyrical expression, meaning the sonnet is usually a first-person meditation on a subject, as opposed to, say, a narrative poem. What else do we want to say about the sonnet in general? Well, it's obviously a form that invites extreme condensation, really pressing as much meaning as possible into 14 lines. It's not a very great length to write about a complicated subject like love in, but that's one of the challenges of the form. It invites the poet to write an especially dense form of verse where complicated feelings, large, difficult, are somehow expressed concisely in 14 lines. So that's second. Third, the first being the sonnet had its start in the love lyric, the second being that the sonnet invites condensation, and third, I think the sonnet is very, very much invites, how do I want to put this? Variation on a standard form. If you're writing a sonnet, you're basically saying to the reader, okay, I'm going to write 14 lines in iambic pentameter, and I'm going to write in a set rhyme scheme. How do you keep that from being boring? How do you keep that alive? How do you keep it fresh? How do you give it verve? Well, that's part of the challenge of the sonnet too, is coming up with ways to diverge from the form. Maybe there's a slight diverge in rhyme scheme through slant rhyme, or maybe there's a slight divergence in the metrical pattern through using, say, a trochaic foot now and again, or a spondaic foot now and again. So what really makes a sonnet work is not following by rote the sonnet form as if you were cooking by a recipe, but rather taking the sonnet form as a sort of invitation to follow a set of rules, knowing that you're going to break them. Not break them in a radical way, because then we no longer have a sonnet, but breaking them in small ways that become very significant for the meaning of your poem. Let's have a look quickly at two sonnets from John Keats. Let's first look at his famous his famous Petrarchan or Italian sonnet. I'm having a difficult time speaking. Let's first look at his famous Italian sonnet or Petrarchan sonnet. Really his first great poem, some say, on first looking into Chapman's Homer. Now I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to talk about just a few issues in the poem that will illustrate what I've been saying thus far. On first looking into Chapman's Homer, Chapman translated Homer in the 17th century, famous for a really dynamic, rugged translation of Homer that was very amenable to the Romantic poets, as opposed to Alexander Pope's tamer 18th century translation of Homer's Odyssey. Much have I traveled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. I'm going to start over. Much have I traveled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told, that deep-browed Homer ruled as his demesne. Yet never did I breathe its pure serene, till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies, when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez, when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. So look at the rhyme scheme. Gold, seen, been, bean, that's a slant rhyme there. Gold, seen, been, hold, A-B-B-A. Then the next quatrain, told, demean, serene, bold, A-B-B-A. So that is the octave. And what happens in the octave? Basically, the poet's telling us that I've traveled around a lot. And I was told in the midst of my travels that there was a guy named Homer who once lived, but I never really understood Homer. I never felt the power of Homer. I never breathed the pure serene of Homer's verse until I read him in Chapman's translation. till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. That's the octave. A, B, B, A, B, B, A. But then in the sestet, he tells us how it felt to breathe that pure serene. What did it feel like to read Homer in Chapman's translation? Then. So basically the structure of the poem is, when I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold, when I read his translation of Homer, octave, more or less, then I felt what? I felt like I was an astronomer looking at this at space, and suddenly a new planet came into my vision. Or I felt like I was an explorer, Cortez discovering the Pacific. Well, Cortez didn't really discover the Pacific. That's a historical error there, but who cares? Like an explorer is staring at the Pacific. Now, and that sestet rhymes C, D, C, C, D, C. Right? No, I'm sorry. Take that back. C, D, C, D, C, D. Skies, kin, eyes, men. Surmise, Darien. Skies, eyes, surmise, kin, men, Darien. So there you have it, an Italian sonnet with the rhyme scheme, the basic octave sestet structure, the volta being a term for that term between the octave and the sestet. Now in terms of scansion, the poem is almost entirely in iambic pentameter. I'm going to hit some of these lines exaggerated form to give you a sense of that. Much have I traveled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. So maybe a little variation here and there, but that's straight up iambic pentameter. But when we get to the sestet, there are shifts in the verse. Why? Because we're moving into a new land. We're moving into newness and freshness and strangeness. So the patterns are breaking. The rules are being cast aside. So it makes sense that Keats would violate that basic metrical pattern in the sestet, and indeed he does. So, for example, in line 10, when a new planet swims into his kin, that's a trochaic, but you wouldn't say when a new planet, it's like when a new planet swims into his kin. So we have a trochaic foot there, which signals that kind of break, we might say, from regular iambic. And then the 13th line also begins with a trochaic foot. Looked at each other with a wild surmise. You wouldn't say looked at each other. It's like looked at each other with a wild surmise. So, and then the final line, silent upon a peak in Darien, yet another trochaic foot. Silent upon a peak in Darien. So we have three lines that open with a trochaic foot. Again, signaling that we're in new territory now, and therefore we need new patterns that violate the set pattern of iambic pentameter. In line 12, we also have a caesura, a break, a big dash. He stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other in wild surmise. So there's another break there. So again, a kind of slight fragmentation of the order that we saw before. So that's just an example. I could go into more detail here, obviously, about how that Italian sonnet by Keats works. Now there's another one of Keats, a sonnet. This is a Shakespearean sonnet. When I have fears that I may cease to be. When I have fears that I may cease to be, before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain, before high piled books in charactery hold like rich garners the full ripened grain. When I behold upon the night's starred face huge cloudy symbols of a high romance, and think that I may never live to trace their shadows with the magic hand of chance. And when I feel, fair creature of an hour, that I shall never look upon thee more, never have relish in the fairy power of unreflecting love, then on the shore of the wide world I stand alone and think, to love and fame to nothingness do sink. So this is a poem about basically a poet saying, oh, when I start thinking about my death, I start thinking about the things I want to do. I want to write poems. I want to fall in love. And we have the Shakespearean rhyme scheme. We have A, B, A, B, B, brain, character, grain, C, D, C, D, face, romance, trace, chance, E, F, E, F, hour, more, power, shore, and then the couplet, GG, think, sink. So that's all there. But notice in this case, for the first 12 lines, we get a variation on the same theme. We do not have the octave sestet division here. Basically, the poet's saying, when I think about dying, I think about all the books I want to write that I haven't written yet. That's the first quatrain. Second quatrain, when I think about dying, I think about how I would like to write romances or poems about sort of idealistic worlds. And when I fear that I'm dying, and this is the third quatrain, I'm afraid I'll never find love. I'll die before I found the kind of romantic love I want to find. So we have the same theme, things I want to do before I die, in three different forms. I want to write more before I die. I want to write more romances before I die. I want to fall in love before I die. And we only get the break, the turn in line 12, when we get actually a caesura of unreflecting love, semicolon dash. Then on the shore of the wide world I stand alone and think, to love and fame do nothing is to sing. What's the shift? It's almost as if the poet says, when I think about all these things, when I think about what I want to do but can't, then what do? I stand on the shore of the wide world alone and think, to love and fame do nothing is to sing. I reach a point where I don't care about love and fame anymore. All I want to do is stand on the shore of the wide world and think. So this poem dramatizes how misguided it is to spend your life wishing you were doing something that you're not doing. To spend your life thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to die, I better write books. Oh my gosh, I'm going to die, I better write romance. Oh my gosh, I'm going to die, I better fall in love. That's not a fruitful way of thinking about the world. It's best just to let love and fame go and stand alone upon the shore, looking out into the unknown, looking out into what you don't know, and think. So you see the poet in the couplet says, I want to think, whereas just before he says that the kind of love he wants is unreflecting, suggesting that to want to fall in love before you die, worrying about that all the time, is not to reflect well. But to think is to let love and fame sink to nothingness and just stand upon the shore of the wild world alone and think. Now there's some shifts here, as we might imagine, as we start moving toward this big change in the final two lines. Line 11, we begin with the trochaic foot, never have relish in fairy power, right there. And then in line 13, we open with a pyrrhic foot, no accents, two unaccented syllables, followed by a spondy, two accented syllables. Of the wide world I stand alone and think, till love and fame to nothing is to sing. So we have two shifts there in the metrical pattern. We also have that big caesura in line 12 that breaks the kind of flow, the iambic pentameter flow that we've seen so far. So again, I could show other ways that Keats is deviating from the standard sonnet form. The standard sonnet form. He's violating the expectation that every line will be in iambic pentameter. He's doing that metrically. He's doing it in terms of punctuation as well. So those are two examples of two different kinds of sonnets, the two main kinds of sonnets, primary kinds of sonnets in the English language. We've seen in Keats both a Petrarchan sonnet and a Shakespearean sonnet, and we've seen a little bit about how each of those sonnets suggests a particular kind of structure, and we've seen how Keats violates the conventions of the English sonnet in order to reinforce the meanings that he wants to convey in his poems.